Hold still now.
Ugh.
Almost done.
Imagine for a second a typical hospital in enlightened medieval Europe. Doctors, looking as smart and important as possible, apply leeches to you, perform bloodletting, and whisper prayers while you slowly but surely bleed to death from a simple scratch or splinter. Sounds like a great, reliable plan for a speedy trip to the afterlife, doesn't it? Hello, everyone, and today we're going to shatter some stereotypes about medicine of the past. Now let's fast forward to the cold, icy, wind-swept shores of 9th century Scandinavia. Harsh, bearded warriors are returning on their drakars from yet another brutal raid, their bodies covered in scars and fresh wounds from swords and axes. Do you think they treated their injuries solely by shouting praises to Odin and applying dirty soil? Not a chance. Forget everything you've seen in popular Hollywood movies. In reality, the medicine of these barbarians was so advanced, precise, and effective that modern science is still in shock, throwing up its hands in amazement. While people in Europe were dying of the common cold, the Vikings were performing the most complex surgeries. In this video, we'll take a detailed look at exactly how Scandinavian healers brought hopeless warriors back from the brink of death. And most importantly, be sure to watch this video all the way to the end. At the end, I'll reveal the secret recipe for their diagnostic onion soup, which they use to unerringly identify damage to internal organs just by its smell. I swear, this ingenious method will blow your mind. Get comfortable. Give this video a big like right now. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any new historical investigations. And let's get ready to be amazed. We're used to thinking of Vikings as machines of destruction. In pop culture, all they do is scream, swing axes, and raid peaceful monasteries. But here's the most interesting part of this story. No army could have conquered half of Europe if its soldiers were dying from every infection. Constant military campaigns required not only good weapons but also excellent medical support. And the Scandinavians created a survival system that worked better than any of its contemporaries. At that time, enlightened Europe firmly believed in the balance of the 4 humors in the body. If you had a stomachache or were coming down with a fever, they would simply bleed you. Monks and doctors believed that this would drive the disease out of the body. As a result, a patient who might have survived died from blood loss and weakness. The Vikings viewed this approach with utter incomprehension. To them, every drop of a warrior's blood was worth its weight in gold. Their logic was extremely simple and brutal. If a sword cuts a hole in a person, that hole must be closed, not new ones made. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Northern healers relied on practical experience, not on philosophical treatises in Latin. They didn't try to exorcise demons from a wound. They tried to stop the bleeding and prevent the flesh from rotting. Today, we call this approach evidence-based medicine. The Scandinavians simply called it common sense. If a method didn't work, the patient died, and the method was no longer used. If a method helped a warrior pick up his shield again, it became the gold standard of treatment. It was a brutal but incredibly effective form of natural selection for medical practices. At the same time, the Vikings clearly understood the difference between diseases and injuries. Chronic illnesses were treated with herbs, diets, and rest, but combat wounds were dealt with right on the spot, often in the midst of an ice storm or mud. My hands start to shake just at the thought of such field surgery. But the northern healers had no time for panic. They carried special sets of tools comparable to a modern Special Forces first aid kit. These included tweezers for removing bone fragments, needles, thread, and sharp knives. Interestingly, surgical instruments were often made of higher quality steel than ordinary household knives. Craftsmen forged them with particular care, knowing the cost of a mistake. A single
friend.
dull scalpel could cost
have
the
something
life
here.
of a jarl or an experienced helmsman. That is why a doctor's equipment cost a fortune. Moreover, these people had a clear understanding of human anatomy. Experience butchering animals and
blood
constant
flows
practice
this
on
way.
humans paid off.
A delicate
European
balance.
doctors were often afraid to cut into bodies due to religious prohibitions. The Vikings, on the other hand, calmly studied the structure of muscles, bones, and blood vessels. They knew
Does it
where it
feel
was
better?
safe to cut
Yes.
and where a single
Just a
wrong
moment
move
more.
would result in a
You're
gush of
strong.
blood. This gave them a tremendous advantage over any European surgeon, and herein lies the main paradox of the era. The fiercest warriors turned out to be the most caring medics of their
winter
time.
bites
They
hard this
understood
year.
that a
Aye,
wounded
keep the
comrade in
fire
arms
stoked.
was not a burden. He was a valuable asset,
Keep your
the
head up,
result
lad.
of years of training and
all right.
campaigns. That is why they fought to the last breath for the life of every member of their team. Compare this to the armies of Charlemagne or other kings.
Hold on,
There,
brother.
a rank-and-file
Almost there.
infantryman was expendable and
Keep
easily
moving.
replaced.
We've got you.
If you fell in battle, a new peasant would be sent to take your place the very next day. In the north,
Tighten the
people were
line.
few and
Hold
far
fast.
between, and
Now.
every skilled sailor was irreplaceable. The economy of survival dictated its own harsh rules for caring for one's fellow man. It was precisely this need to preserve lives that drove them to conduct medical experiments. They sought remedies in the forests, swamps, and even in the kitchen. Some of their methods seem like pure magic today, even though they have a clear scientific basis. And one such method involves a common ingredient that's probably sitting in your fridge right now. Let that fact sink in for a moment, because what follows is true surgical magic. A penetrating abdominal wound in the Middle Ages was a
You must take
100% death
It
sentence.
burns.
If a sword or
Just a
spear
sip,
pierced
it
the
will help.
intestines, the
Thank
person
you,
would
Mother.
slowly and painfully
steady.
die of
Watch your
peritonitis.
step.
In such cases,
Careful.
European physicians
We
would
can't
simply
drop
say
him.
prayers
Almost through
and
this
wait
patch.
for the inevitable.
broth is nearly
They
ready.
couldn't
Rest
look
now.
inside the body to
Smell
assess
that?
the extent
It's
of the
been too
damage.
long.
But the
Be still,
Vikings
it will
devised a brilliant diagnostic test that
It's
is
all right, my boy.
astonishingly simple. And all they needed was an ordinary onion and a pot of boiling water. Female healers, known as lekni, would cook a thick soup made of onions, leeks, and aromatic herbs. They would force the wounded warrior to eat this hellish concoction right on the battlefield or in a tent. It sounds like torture for someone whose abdomen has been pierced. You're bleeding to death, and they're offering you a hot
Here,
meal.
drink this slowly.
But behind this madness lay rock-solid medical logic. After the patient had eaten this
May the
pungent
gods show
soup,
him favor.
the physician would approach the wound. He would literally stick
fights
his
well.
nose into the open wound on the warrior's abdomen.
Gently, hold still.
The doctor would inhale
Burns.
deeply,
That is
drawing
good.
air directly
It
from the
cleanses.
gaping hole in the body. Why such strange procedures on a dying man? It's very simple. They were checking the integrity of
bad
the
shape.
gastrointestinal tract.
I know.
It was the medieval
I'm doing what I
equivalent
can.
of a modern
north,
X-ray with a
doesn't it?
contrast
Perhaps.
agent. If the
brings
physician
cold with
detected
it.
a strong
The journey is
smell of
near, Father.
onions coming from the
Rest now.
wound, the diagnosis
May
was
the
clear.
ancestors welcome
It
you.
meant that the intestines or stomach had been pierced
Drink
right
this.
through.
It will
Food
make you
was spilling
stronger.
into the abdominal cavity,
Thank you.
and there was no chance of survival. In such cases, the warrior was given strong, pain-relieving herbs and allowed to die with dignity.
saved me.
Given no one wasted precious resources on a hopeless patient, but if there was no smell of onions, that changed absolutely everything. The absence of the smell meant that the internal organs were undamaged. The sword had merely cut through muscle and fat without touching anything vital. And then, the healer would immediately set about saving the patient's life. They would begin to clean, suture, and bandage the wound with the
Hold
utmost
still, warrior. This
care.
will ease the
Modern
burning.
surgeons confirm that
God,
this
it
method is
stings.
entirely effective.
strong, son.
The pungent
Hold
smell
still.
of onions does
will
indeed
ease the
penetrate
pain.
damaged tissue easily. In modern medicine, they do the same thing, only using expensive dyes and equipment. But the Vikings figured out this method 1,000 years ago on the cold shores of a fjord. Your modern medical degree would hardly help you come up with something like this under extreme conditions. At the same time, onions served more than just a diagnostic purpose in their medicine. They also possess powerful antibacterial properties, killing surrounding microbes. Onion and garlic juice contain phytoncides that literally burn away infection. So the very act of eating such a soup was already a form of therapy for the immune system. It was, in essence, an ancient, broad-spectrum antibiotic. At that time, Europe treated deep wounds with hot oil or dirty rags. Just reading about these European methods is enough to make you sick. They literally sealed bacteria inside the wound, causing purulent inflammation. The Northerners, on the other hand, left the wound open to allow pus to drain if it appeared. They rinsed cuts with clean water or even light beer. Beer, by the way, was much safer than ordinary river water. During the brewing process, it underwent heat treatment that killed parasites. Modern science calls this pasteurization. The Vikings didn't know about bacteria, but they clearly saw the results. The Vikings rinse a wound with beer. The person lives. Rinse it with water from a puddle. The person dies in agony. So onion soup was just the tip of the iceberg of their medical knowledge. They developed a system for triaging the wounded centuries before Napoleon did. Rapid diagnosis allowed them to save time and rescue those who could actually be saved. It sounds like dry pragmatism, but it was precisely this that won them many wars. And ahead of us lies an even more amazing story about how they set broken bones. In battles fought with axes and heavy swords, broken bones were a common occurrence. A blow to the shield could easily break an arm, even without a direct hit from a blade. In most armies of that time, a compound fracture meant amputation. Surgeons would simply chop off the limb with an axe and cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron. Imagine this procedure without proper anesthesia or sterile conditions. The chance of dying from pain shock or blood poisoning was nearly 100%. But archaeological excavations of Scandinavian burial sites tell a completely different story. Scientists have examined thousands of Viking skeletons throughout Northern Europe, and the results of these studies left anthropologists literally speechless with amazement. They found a huge number of bones showing signs of severe fractures, but the most important thing is that these bones had healed perfectly. People with such injuries lived for decades after being wounded. How did they manage to align the fragments of shattered bones so precisely? The answer lies in a deep understanding of the biomechanics of the human body. Northern healers used a complex system of wooden splints and rigid bandages. They didn't simply tie a stick to a broken leg, as was done in Europe. They carved splints to the individual shape of the limb to ensure perfect immobilization. Moreover, before applying the splint, the bone had to be set in place. Moreover, this required considerable physical strength and nerves of steel on the part of the healer. The patient was given strong mead or a decoction of soothing herbs to alleviate the pain. Then, several strong men would stretch the limb, overcoming muscle spasms. At that moment, the healer would feel for the bone fragments with his fingers and set them into the correct position. A single wrong move could rupture an artery and kill the warrior. Once the bone was back in place, the limb was wrapped in soft wool. This was done to prevent a rigid wooden splint from compressing the blood vessels. Modern emergency room doctors do the same thing by placing cotton padding under the cast. The splint was then tightly secured with leather straps or linen bandages. Over time, the leather straps would shrink slightly, providing an even more secure hold. But here's what's truly remarkable about their approach to treating fractures. The Vikings knew that joints need
Hold still
movement,
now, lad.
otherwise
Thank
they would
you.
permanently lose
The
mobility.
wood is damp.
That's why, in cases of lower leg fractures,
it roaring.
they often left the knee
That's better.
free to move.
Aye, it is.
Modern orthopedists call this a functional treatment method. The Scandinavians arrived at this principle purely through trial and error
The whispers of
1,000
the old
years
gods
earlier.
guide us still.
In some graves, skeletons with
sea,
femur fractures
where
were
our
found.
ancestors sailed.
Breaking the thickest bone in the body is a catastrophe even today. But these fractures in the Vikings also healed, and with minimal shortening of the leg. This means they knew how to create a limb-lengthening system.
Hold still.
Healers attached
Just a little
weights to
more.
the leg to prevent the muscles from pulling the bone
Good, let me
fragments
see.
together. This level of
Warmth from the
engineering is
fire
on
suits
par
you.
with modern trauma departments.
I know.
Of course,
Thank
not
you.
all fractures resulted in a successful recovery. Open fractures, where the bone pierced the skin, often led to fatal infections. But even here, the Northerners had a trick up their sleeve. They used sphagnum moss, which grew in abundance in Scandinavian bogs. This moss absorbs 20 times its own weight in liquid. In addition, sphagnum has incredible antiseptic properties. It contains sphagnol, a substance that kills most known bacteria. The Vikings applied this moss to open wounds and fractures. Essentially, they had natural, sterile bandages that didn't need to be washed. Use it, throw it away, pluck a new one.
The forest
Brilliant
offers its
and
healing
extremely
touch, placing this
hygienic.
moss upon
During
your
World
wound.
War I,
I
the
understand.
British Army rediscovered this method out of desperation. When you look at these fused bones in museums, you get a strange feeling. You realize that behind every perfect
May the
bone
All-Father
suture
guide
lies a
this needle.
sleepless
Make
night
haste,
for
old
an
woman.
ancient
You'll
doctor.
be all right, I
These
promise.
people pieced their comrades back together bit by bit, like a construction
hold on.
set,
The
and their
battle is
methods
done.
worked so well that many soldiers
many are
returned to
lost.
duty after severe injuries. But next,
You are not
we'll
alone.
talk about something that sends chills
We
down
will
your
get through
spine.
this.
But we'll discuss how they drilled holes in the skulls of living people. When we think of medicines from the past, dubious witches' potions come to mind. In European cities, apothecaries sold powder made from Egyptian mummies and ground-up unicorn horn. People
Fresh herbs
paid a
here, the
fortune
best
for
in the kingdom.
absolute junk that was
Good
of
day,
no
noble sir.
use
Take a look at these fine
whatsoever.
wares.
Wealthy
Have you seen my
European
dog,
nobles
Balthazar?
hoped to cure serious illnesses
This
with
vial
such
holds great
fake
power, my lord.
potions.
Its
Market
properties are
vendors
unmatched.
profited from others
can I be
suffering
certain
and
of your
fear,
claim?
concocting
Keep
the
him
most
close.
absurd recipes.
The air bites.
But in Scandinavia, this approach to treatment simply could not take
do we go
root.
now?
The Vikings had no time for such blatant commercial nonsense. Amid constant raids and a harsh climate, they needed tried and true, reliable methods. They needed remedies that could instantly stop bleeding and reduce inflammation right on the battlefield. And their medicine chest literally grew beneath their feet in the dense northern forests. Local healers carefully studied the properties of every plant around them. They passed this knowledge down from generation to
You see how the
generation,
leaves curl
selecting
here?
only the very best
That means
remedies.
it's ready.
The northern
Yes, I
wilderness was
see. It's
harsh,
beautiful.
but it also provided people
Keep
with
it
everything
safe.
they needed for
Pass it
healing.
on.
One of the main antiseptics in their arsenal was ordinary honey. The Scandinavians collected it from wild bees and held it in very high regard for its healing
your arms
properties.
still, warrior.
Honey is a product
honey
with the
will aid
highest
your
sugar
healing.
content and low
Your
moisture
remedies are
levels.
always welcome,
In
lad.
such an environment, dangerous microorganisms simply cannot grow or multiply. Any bacterium that enters the honey literally dries out and dies instantly. In addition, upon contact with a wound, honey releases microscopic doses of hydrogen peroxide. This occurs thanks to a special enzyme added by the bees. The result is a continuous and very gentle disinfection of damaged tissues. Viking healers generously applied honey to deep cuts before bandaging them. This helped prevent infection even under the dirtiest conditions of a campaign. The sweet remedy protected the warrior's flesh from forest dirt. Modern scientists long scoffed at honey-based treatments, dismissing them as peasant superstition. They believed that ancient recipes were based solely on blind faith and superstition.
Careful.
However, advances in laboratory research forced the medical
thanks.
community to completely change its opinion. Scientists conducted rigorous tests and began mass-producing medical honey patches. Today, these products are successfully used in the world's leading
delicious.
surgical clinics. It turned out that honey can even combat bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. In this era of crisis in modern medicine, this property has become a true lifesaver for doctors. The Scandinavians did not know the word resistance,
still.
but they clearly saw their patients thriving and the results of their work. For ease of use, they created special medicinal formulations. They mixed honey with animal fat to create a convenient antibacterial ointment. This remedy stayed on the skin for a long time and wasn't washed off by water during sea voyages. The thick ointment created a reliable barrier against external infection. Another ingenious solution was the use of a certain type of mold. Yes, that very same green mold that you scrape off bread with disgust. In ancient times, people weren't afraid of such things. Instead, they sought to use them to their advantage for survival. Healers deliberately cultivated mold on pieces of old cheese in damp cellars. They created ideal temperature conditions for the reproduction of the necessary microorganisms. This mold paste was carefully applied to festering battle wounds. To modern people, this sounds like a surefire way to get blood poisoning, but the effect was exactly the opposite. The natural remedy destroyed the very cause of the disease deep within the tissue. The infection receded, the pus disappeared, and the wound began to heal like before their eyes. The warriors quickly returned to duty after this unusual treatment. What then was the secret of this ointment, which seemed so dirty at first glance? It's very simple. Mold secretes penicillin to kill competing bacteria. This is a natural struggle for survival in the microcosm, which the Vikings harnessed to their
Try to
advantage.
relax. It's
Alexander
almost done.
Fleming received the Nobel Prize for the
longer.
discovery
This
of
will help.
penicillin in the 20th century. But the peoples of the North were centuries ahead of official science. The Vikings used a primitive form of penicillin 1,000 years before its triumph in laboratories. They intuitively understood the laws of nature without complex microscopes or chemical analyses. They simply applied the antibiotic directly to a warrior's inflamed flesh. This saved thousands of lives when
cloth will
ordinary
help you.
herbal
Take
poultices
it
were
and
no
remember
longer
how to use
effective.
it.
Wounded
Now watch
warriors
closely
survived
how I
even
fold it.
after severe cases of gangrene and infections. Yarrow was used to stop severe bleeding. This unassuming plant possesses tremendous power, capable of saving a person from certain death. It's no coincidence that people still call
Hold
this
still.
herb soldier's
This will help.
herb
It
or
stings.
wound healer.
Just a moment.
Its healing properties
It
were
will
known
ease
to
the
many
pain.
ancient warriors around the world. If you crush the yarrow leaves and apply them to a wound, the bleeding stops in a matter of minutes. The active compounds in the plant cause a sudden spasm of the blood vessels. They instantly constrict the capillaries and activate the body's
Thank you.
natural blood clotting mechanisms.
Take it.
In the heat of battle,
will help.
this was the only chance to prevent a person from bleeding to death from a deep cut. Blood loss was the leading cause of death in early medieval battles. Every Viking carried a small pouch of dried yarrow with him in case of unforeseen circumstances. It was an essential part
Here,
of every
drink this, it will
warrior's
help.
campaign gear.
Thank
The
you.
herb was harvested at a strictly defined time of year, when it was at its most potent. Special attention was paid to treating burns, which frequently occurred on ships. Wooden drakkers required the constant use of fire for various purposes. Sea voyages were accompanied by bonfires on shore and burning resin during sieges of cities. During naval battles, enemies often tried to set each other's ships on fire. There were many victims of fire, and healers developed an effective system of care. Decoctions made from oak and willow bark were used to treat burned skin. These trees grew everywhere and served as excellent raw materials for northern medicine. Oak bark contains tannins, which dry out the wound and form a protective film. This film prevented dangerous bacteria from penetrating the damaged skin. Willow bark, meanwhile, is a natural source of salicylic acid, the basis of modern aspirin. In other words, the patient received not only tissue treatment, but also a powerful pain reliever. Reducing the pain shock helped the body recover its strength more quickly. A sip of willow decoction, and the pain from a severe burn became bearable. In Europe at the same time, burns were treated by applying manure or soil. This led to horrific infections and the agonizing deaths of patients. The difference in approaches to survival is simply incredible for that era. Scandinavian methods were based on pure pragmatism and observation of nature. For some, it was natural aspirin and antibiotics. For others, mud and prayers. For a long time, the Christian world rejected such methods, considering them witchcraft. The Vikings, however, valued only tangible results that saved their people. Practical benefits were more important to them than any religious dogma. And all this knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation by healers. They carefully guarded the secrets of gathering and preparing each remedy. They did not write down their recipes in thick books that could burn in a fire. Living memory was far more reliable than any fragile parchment. They wove this knowledge into the sagas, songs, and daily customs of their people. Even young children knew from an early age which leaves to chew when they had a stomach ache. They learned to distinguish poisonous plants from beneficial ones right there while playing in the forest. Medicine was not something elitist, accessible only to a select few wealthy individuals. It was part of the everyday culture of survival for every northern clan. Every member of the community possessed basic first aid skills. This made the entire society more resilient to external threats and diseases. In Scandinavia's harsh climate, nature itself dictated the rules of the game. Mistakes here came at too high a cost, so medicine developed very quickly. What worked quickly became tradition. What killed was quickly forgotten. Natural selection left only the most effective and safest remedies. In Scandinavia's harsh climate, nature itself dictated the rules of the game. What worked quickly became tradition. What killed was quickly forgotten. This brutal pragmatism allowed them to create a true field pharmacology. And with this first aid kit, they could afford to perform the most daring surgical operations. For example, those very brain surgeries we're about to discuss. Trepanation is a procedure that frightens even modern hospital patients. Imagine having a hole drilled in your head while you're fully conscious. It sounds like the plot of a cheap horror movie or a medieval torture scene. Few of our contemporaries would agree to such an ordeal without deep anesthesia. But for Viking-era doctors, this was a perfectly standard neurosurgical procedure. They performed it with remarkable composure and confidence in its success, and they didn't do it to expel evil spirits from the head. They had a perfectly clear medical goal: to save the patient's life. The healers understood the connection between head trauma and a person's subsequent behavior. They sought to eliminate the physical cause of the ailment, not to battle mythical demons. For that time, this was an incredibly progressive and materialistic view of anatomy. In battle, blows to the helmet with a club or an axe often resulted in dents in the skull. Heavy iron weapons caused terrible damage even through sturdy protective gear. Even if the bone wasn't pierced completely, fragments of the skull would press against the brain. This disrupted the nervous system and caused severe headaches. The patient gradually wasted away,
gently.
losing the
Press
ability
down,
to
keep the
walk and
clasp firm.
speak. Extensive internal bleeding would begin, and the person would lose consciousness or convulse. Blood clots would accumulate beneath the bone, posing a deadly threat. Pressure inside the skull would rise rapidly, killing the warrior in a matter of hours. The brain was literally suffocating in that confined space. The only way to save the person was to relieve this internal pressure. The physician would take a special instrument resembling a hand drill with a very sharp blade. These tools were made from the finest steel and carefully sharpened by master craftsmen. Several strong men held the patient firmly so he wouldn't flinch from the pain. Any accidental movement of the head could lead to the patient's instant death. Therefore, securing the body was a crucial part of preparing for the procedure. The surgical site on the head was carefully shaved and washed with strong alcohol. This helped remove dirt and hair that could introduce infection into the wound. Then, the doctor began to slowly and methodically drill out a small piece of bone above the site of the injury. The process required enormous physical effort and at the same time, incredible caution. One careless movement and the instrument would pierce the meninges. Precision akin to that of a jeweler was required to stop just a millimeter short of the brain. The surgeon had to perfectly control the force applied to the drill. The skill of these surgeons was so great that they could sense a change in bone density. They knew when hard bone tissue gave way to the soft inner lining. This skill was honed over many years of rigorous practice and hundreds of procedures. Every experienced doctor cherished his hands and protected them from accidental injury. As soon as a piece of the skull was removed, congealed blood flowed out of the opening. Black clots emerged, releasing the compressed tissues. The pressure on the brain dropped instantly, and the patient often regained consciousness right there on the operating table. To those watching, it looked like a true miracle. A dying person would suddenly open their eyes and begin to speak coherently with their rescuers. But the most astonishing aspect of this story lies in the archaeological evidence. The soil of Scandinavia has preserved irrefutable proof of this skill for us. Scientists have studied dozens of Viking-era skulls with characteristic trepanation holes. These findings were made in a wide variety of regions across the Nordic countries. The edges of these holes in the bones were smooth and showed clear signs of healing. This means that the person did not die on the operating table from infection or blood loss. After the bone was drilled, the body continued to live and successfully regained its strength. Bone tissue gradually closed the dangerous opening, protecting the internal organs. About 60% of patients survived this extremely complex procedure. For the Middle Ages, this was a simply fantastic, almost impossible success rate. In other European countries, such results were unimaginable. Doctors there preferred not to intervene in such complex cases, condemning people to certain death. In the enlightened 19th century, survival rates for cranial surgery in London hospitals were lower. English physicians possessed a vast body of theoretical knowledge, but fell short in practice. People were dying en masse from infections caused by the dirty hands of Victorian surgeons. Simple hygiene rules were ignored by medical professors in their expensive suits. They moved from one patient to another, spreading deadly bacteria. Meanwhile, the rugged men in horned helmets, portrayed by Hollywood as savages, had a 60% survival rate. The secret lay in their obsessive attention to cleanliness during treatment. They didn't know the word bacteria, but they clearly associated dirt with certain death.
Drink slowly.
Viking healers used
Thank
only
you.
clean water, fire-scorched instruments, and antiseptic decoctions. This practical experience saved lives where science was powerless to help. After surgery, the hole in the skull was closed with a silver or bone plate. This protected the exposed brain from accidental external blows in the future. The skin was sutured with thin animal sinews or silk threads brought back from raids. Silk thread was a rare and very expensive material, available only to the nobility. Its use reduced the risk of suture infection several times over. The wound was regularly washed with honey water, and the bandages, made of pure linen, were changed. Linen fabric absorbed secretions well and allowed the skin to breathe. A warrior with a silver plate in his head became a living legend among his comrades. He was considered to be marked by a special sign and was respected even more. This was seen as a sign of the god's special favor and the physician's incredible skill. Obviously, such operations were not performed on just anyone due to their complexity. Trepanation was a last resort when other methods had failed. For an ordinary peasant or slave, such expensive treatment was simply out of reach. The instruments for this type of surgery cost a fortune and were passed down from father to son. Each set was kept in perfect order and cleanliness. A physician skilled in trepanation was valued higher than any experienced military commander. There were many warriors, but only a handful of masters capable of bringing them back from the brink of death. The jarls were willing to pay enormous sums in gold to keep such a master by their side. They provided the doctors with the best housing and food during the long winters. A ruler's life depended directly on the skill of his personal physician. European monk chroniclers often describe the Vikings as mindless, bloodthirsty barbarians. They judged the northerners solely by their brutal raids on wealthy monasteries, but the facts show that these barbarians were saving lives using methods from the future. Actual archaeological findings completely refute the old, biased myths. Scandinavian medical culture was, in many ways, ahead of its turbulent times. While people in Paris were praying for deliverance from the plague, neurosurgery was being performed successfully in Uppsala. People in the north relied on their own knowledge and strength rather than on blind faith. This forces us to completely rethink our attitude toward the Dark Ages. This historical period was by no means an era of complete decline and ignorance. The history of medicine is written by the victors, but bones do not lie. Trepanation of the skull was the pinnacle of their surgical art. But who exactly performed these extremely complex procedures on the human body? Most people today are convinced that the healers were old, wise priests with gray beards. However, archaeology and sagas reveal a completely different, surprising truth. The leading surgeons in Scandinavia were more often women than men, and this shatters yet another major historical stereotype. In medieval Christian Europe, women were strictly forbidden from practicing medicine. If a woman knew too much about herbs and anatomy, she could be accused of witchcraft. Healing was considered the privilege of male monks and scholars with a university education. In Viking society, everything was arranged exactly the opposite way. Medicine and surgery were almost exclusively female professions for centuries. These women were respected, feared, and the survival of entire clans depended on them. In ancient texts, they were referred to as lekna, which literally translates as healer. While men hacked at each other with axes on the battlefield, the lekna waited for them behind the lines. They did not sit idly by, waiting for a miracle or divine intervention. They set up actual field hospitals complete with cauldrons for boiling water and sets of instruments. When the battle ended, it was these women who made decisions about life and death. The work of a lekna had nothing to do with the romantic image of a gentle nurse. It was bloody, grueling, and physically exhausting, work typically done by men. They had to set the bones of healthy warriors, amputate shattered limbs, and stitch up lacerated wounds. A female healer had to possess an iron will and strong hands. Often, A patient would scream in pain and struggle, and she would have to hold him down by force. They gained knowledge of the female anatomy through their daily lives. In the harsh conditions of the North, it was the women who were responsible for slaughtering livestock and butchering the carcasses. While butchering a pig or a reindeer, a future healer would study the arrangement of veins, muscles, and joints. Pig anatomy is very similar to human anatomy in many key aspects. So by the time they performed their first operation on a human, the Lechna already had years of practical experience with a knife. They knew exactly how to cut through tissue without damaging a vital artery. The sagas preserve many stories about heroic female healers. One of the most famous tells of a healer named Torbjörg. She could stop massive bleeding with a single tight knot and a properly applied bandage. Warriors believed that such women's hands possessed magical healing powers, but the magic lay solely in their vast experience and cool-headed judgment in critical situations. The social status of a successful healer was incredibly high. They owned their own property and land and could move freely between settlements. For saving the life of a noble jarl, a healer could demand a fortune in silver, and she was paid without question, as people understood the true value of her skills. No one dared to offend a woman who might save your life tomorrow. This reflected the remarkable equality of the era, dictated by the conditions of survival. The training of a new healer began in early childhood. A mother would take her daughter into the forest to gather herbs, moss, and roots. The girl learned to distinguish poisonous plants from useful ones by their scent and the shape of their leaves. Then she began to assist with childbirth and simple surgeries, handing instruments and water to the healer. By the age of 15, the young girl was already capable of performing a finger amputation on her own. European knights, when confronted with Viking armies, experienced a real culture shock. They saw women walking among the wounded and confidently giving orders to men. To the Christian world, this seemed like a violation of every conceivable law of the universe. But while the Crusaders were dying of gangrene under the watchful eyes of praying priests, the pagans survived. Pragmatism triumphed time and again over the dogmatic prejudices of the era. In addition to treating injuries, these women were highly skilled at managing infectious diseases. They knew how to bring down high fevers by wiping patients down with snow and using decoctions made from tree bark. They isolated contagious patients to prevent the infection from wiping out the entire clan. In essence, they implemented quarantine measures long before the term was coined in Venice. The health of an entire settlement rested on the shoulders of these resilient and wise women. History often forgets the names of these great physicians of the early Middle Ages. All that remains are unmarked graves containing surgical instruments alongside the skeletons of women. But their legacy lives on in the principles of modern extreme medicine. They were pioneers of field surgery who were not afraid to defy death itself, and their methods of organizing work on the battlefield were also centuries ahead of their time. The Vikings' medical system would not have been so effective without proper organization. Finding a good remedy is only half the battle in the midst of mass carnage. You also have to administer it before the person bleeds out or freezes to death. So modern military personnel call this the golden hour rule for saving the wounded. The Scandinavians intuitively understood this principle 1,000 years ago on their ships, and they created Europe's first system of medical triage right on the battlefield. When the battle subsided, the healers did not rush to the first moaning person they came across. They quickly surveyed the field, assessing the condition of each wounded warrior. In modern disaster medicine, this is called the triage system. Those who had suffered fatal wounds to the abdomen or head were left to die with honor. They were given weapons to hold so they could enter Valhalla with dignity. Those with minor scrapes were required to help the others. The healers focused all their attention on the third, most important group of wounded, those with severe bleeding and fractures who could still be saved. Such cold calculation may seem cruel, but it saved the greatest number of lives. A doctor did not waste precious time or bandages on the dead, choosing instead to save those who would survive. The wounded were immediately transported to specially equipped tents or huts in the rear. The main enemy of a seriously wounded person is not infection, but severe hypothermia. Blood loss leads to a sharp drop in body temperature and cardiac arrest. The Northerners knew this all too well from their harsh maritime experience. That is why blazing fires were always kept burning in the medical tents to warm the patients. Soldiers were wrapped in warm bearskins and placed near the fire. At the same time, the tents were regularly ventilated to prevent the smoke from irritating the eyes and lungs. Fresh air helped clear out infections, while the heat of the fire warmed the blood-depleted bodies. European hospitals of that time resembled the dark, stuffy, and foul-smelling basements of monasteries. There, patients lay crammed together on dirty straw and breathed in miasmas. The difference in comfort and safety was simply staggering. No less attention was paid to feeding the wounded than to the surgical operations themselves. They were served hearty meat broths made from bones and fresh meat. Such broth contains a huge amount of collagen and nutrients for tissue repair. It was the ideal, easily digestible food for someone who had lost a great deal of strength. In addition, patients were given plenty of sour milk, which restored the stomach's microflora. All these dietary decisions were based not on science, but on centuries of observation. Recovery from a serious injury could take many months, and Viking society took full responsibility for the care of the disabled. If a warrior lost an arm in battle, the clan was obligated to feed and clothe him for the rest of his life. This provided an incredible level of psychological comfort for the soldiers. They went into battle knowing that, if wounded, they would not be left to die in a ditch. In the armies of other European states, a wounded soldier instantly became a destitute vagrant. The king cared nothing for a peasant who could no longer hold a spear. Thousands of maimed veterans begged for alms on the streets of Paris and London. In Scandinavia, however, a veteran who had lost a leg could become a respected blacksmith or a teacher for children. His status remained high because he had sacrificed his health for the common good. Such social protection was a crucial element of the Northern war machine. The warriors' loyalty to their Jarl was absolute because it was built on mutual care. Competent medicine served not merely as a way to stitch up a wound on an arm. It functioned as a powerful tool for motivating and uniting people. When you know you will be taken care of, you fight with redoubled fury. To sum up this logistical marvel, I'd like to say one thing. They weren't just skilled at fighting, they were experts at saving their own. Their field hospitals were a beacon of order in a world of utter chaos, but this entire system would have collapsed without one small yet crucial detail. I'm talking about a daily routine that saved more lives than all the scalpels in the world. We'll discuss how the Vikings approached basic personal hygiene. The Viking Age came to an end, giving way to the harsh realities of the classical European Middle Ages. Along with their ships, much of the North's unique medical knowledge faded into the past. It took Europe centuries of painful experience and millions of lives to rediscover these truths. Today, we look at archaeological finds and realize just how much smarter our ancestors were. Their medicine was harsh and uncompromising, yet astonishingly logical and effective. And this is the best proof that true intellect always triumphs over blind faith.